Welcome to Prime Suspects. Alongside Adam Bjorn and Prime Sports co-founder Joe Brennan Jr., I'm your host, Matt Landis. Adam, preseason football is now underway for all 32 teams. So from week one results and any surprising handle on exhibition games to potential movement in futures markets in response to the first preseason slate, where has NFL action at Prime Sports and BetCris over the last week stood out most to you?
So I haven't seen anything major on the future markets. I am seeing a little bit more volume come in, but nothing that really moved it after week one. Two games that really highlighted at week one volume-wise, where it was 90% plus on both the teams, which generally when I'm looking at the charts and see 90% plus, I know the lines moved, so that's kind of the first thing I look at. Titans had moved from 1.5 to 6 last week. I think they won by 6. So again, there was definitely the early money one, maybe the late money as it went back the other way didn't. Cincinnati went from 2 to 7. They won by 2. So definitely one for the books that the line moved a lot. There was a bit coming back the other way, but definitely needed Cincinnati in that spot. But overall, I mean, what it is preseason, there was some decent volume. I think the master volume was sitting around 50% of the overall volume, which doesn't surprise at all. Looking at it this week, it's looking very similar. Games in particular that are showing out as high volume is Colts, Falcons. Again, this one looks like it's opened 1.5. It's sitting around 3.5 now and getting a bit of buyback the other way. Another one that's definitely heavy is Buccaneers, Chiefs. All over the Buccaneers. Looks like they opened around +1 or pick 'em and now up to around -5. So it's usually, as I said, you look at the charts and you can see this one is like literally 98% of the money on the Bucks, 100% of the master money on the Bucks, all heading one way. But, good volume, good action. People are warming up. They're taking their shots and, we'll see how it plays out. So it looks like we went 1-1 week one on the two big moves and definitely some big moves happening already this week.
And a lot's been made of some of the bigger moves in week one not coming through for a lot of people who may have even originated this team. So I'd be inclined to chalk that up to small sample size. Preseason is still a beatable market, especially when you talk about half of the action being courtesy of the Masters. But what else would you care to say to people who might say, oh, preseason week one didn't work out so well for anybody who was part of this team? If we look at the next couple of weeks in the preseason market more broadly, how do you look at the aggressive moves and how that tends to net out on both sides of the counter?
Yeah, if you're getting on that early stuff, get that early stuff, play that steam. It's generally right. We did win first week NFL, held small margin, but the early one. The key is generally actually once it moves to its peak, coming back the other way. Like many things over the years, we've seen things steam so far when there's no real efficiency in the market that the value becomes on the other side and bringing it back the other way. This is an information game. I'm sure there's news about quarterbacks that are going to play a quarter or a half or 3 quarters. Definitely the Cincinnati Bengals one was based on Burrows playing lengthy time, all this other information. It can be right and it can be still wrong. The information can be wrong and it can still be right. I mean, that's kind of the fun of it all. But yeah, if you can get those early numbers and you catch the early steam or get inside of where that's going, whether it's based on information or just these numbers aren't strong, then definitely play it. But also if you miss it, start looking at the other end when it peaks 5 or 6 points in the other direction and potentially looking at it coming back the other way a little bit.
And that brings to mind the notion of betting numbers, not teams, but especially in such an information-driven market as the preseason, how do you go about assessing when a number might have reached its peak in terms of some heavy steam and just when to go about looking to play the other side?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's still some work done in these games by the bookmakers and the odds makers to find a number that looks right based on the information that's created at that time. If the information's not that strong based on that original number, and that's kind of where, there's a bit of advantage being on this side of the counter and seeing who's betting what and what's real and what's not of that nature, how much of it is steam versus the originator taking, 1.5, say Cincinnati, winning by 2, and the 1.5 one's a 2 push, the 2.5, the 3, all the way to, I think it was 7, is on the wrong side, but it moved 5.5 points. When is it a point where you're just reassessing the teams at a new number rather than worrying about where it come from? And guilty of it myself, knowing what the original number was and you missed it and then trying not to get involved. You just got to reassess it at the new number and see where you think your number is at and ultimately whether that's the value. You may have had the game at 3.5. It opened 2. You hesitated, and then it goes to 7. Is there that much additional information that took you from your 3.5 to 7 on your own number? And this is where, the top downs get into trouble of playing numbers rather than the information and knowing why a number was created and how it got to where it got to, because the right number in the beginning might have been 7 and not 2. So yeah, that's the challenges of all of it and knowing where it's at. But ultimately, this is a game of backing yourself as much as it is backing a line and knowing what work you've done and how much you put into it. If you're just lollygagging it and just sort of throwing darts and just want to get involved because you're a degenerate, well, you might get the worst of it in those spots. If you feel like you've done the work and you put in a position where you're confident it was 3, you got some information that burrows and that maybe that takes you to 4.5, but it doesn't take you all the way to 7, where ultimately you can get involved in the other direction after the steam settled down and the money and the bookmakers have maybe panicked and moved a little bit further than they needed to as well.
One more for you, Adam, then we'll bring Joe into the fold. From UFC 330 to the rest of the sporting calendar, any noteworthy non-NFL action over the past week?
So UFC was a huge week. Volume was huge. I think we held like 16% on the UFC. I pretty much missed a weekend of sports with the time change and the traveling and all that fun stuff. But I did look at the MMA numbers and it was a huge hold. I don't know which result brought that in for the majority of it or if there was a collection of favorites that got beat. But I will say that stood out on the weekend's numbers as I got the weekly update of last week, holding, I think it was around 16, 17% on a significant volume held on the UFC 330 last weekend.
All right. And Joe, with that, we will go ahead and bring you in here. The last week has brought us a shocking sale in the NBA, a shocking debut in Major League Baseball, and a not so shocking, but still headline grabbing AP preseason college football poll. So from the Lakers selling for $12.5 billion, topping their own record of $10 billion less than a year ago for most expensive sale in North American sports history, and with the team's current governor, Jeannie Buss, reportedly contesting any attempt to sell the family's remaining ownership stake of 17.8%, to Joshua Baez of the St. Louis Cardinals becoming the first player to hit 3 home runs in a major league debut, and doing it in style with a 449-foot home run on the first pitch he saw and homers in each of his next 2 plate appearances, to that AP preseason college football poll dominated by the Big Ten and the SEC, excluding Clemson, marking the Tigers' first time unranked heading into a season in 15 years, and including Texas in the top 5, despite 0 first-place votes and what appears to be a brutal schedule. Not to mention some eyebrow-raising Little League World Series betting talk making the rounds on gambling Twitter. Where's your attention right now in the wide world of sports?
You loaded this up so much. I think it's guys who are like tuning in to listen to Adam is like, this is their cue. Like, hey, time to take a bathroom break. Joe's going to talk about sports culture and shit. Jordan Baez, retire. Okay. It's never going to get any better. But I mean, that was definitely an example of not having a book on a batter when he steps up. The modern game, it's amazing how both ways, hitters and pitching, they're so dependent on their preparation right now in this game. Everybody's so athletic, everybody's so good. And just the advantage that a hitter has when they come up. I mean, it's not the first time you heard about a guy coming up and then all of a sudden he just lights it up. And then you think that you've got the next Willie Mays coming up and playing for you, only to after one tour through the division, suddenly they're hitting 154 and not getting on base. And then they eventually go back down. That was interesting. I'll tell you what, the really interesting transaction for me is obviously the Lakers, we'll put it in air quotes, sale, since it seems like Jeannie Buss is certainly dead ending this one, tougher than any of the Roy children in HBO's Succession. The intriguing person in all of this is Joshua Kushner, who, if we just look back a couple of weeks to the last shocking would-be sale in sports, and that was going to be of 20% of the World Cup in a no-bid process, and their standing was Joshua Kushner. He seems to get some really interesting deal flow that also might not necessarily be successful. But the fact that right now Walter is sold, what did somebody say is like the most lucrative fire sale in history, because Walter's got to cover all of his positions in his private credit and insurance empire here right now. So selling off the Lakers for $2.5 billion is certainly a windfall, but amazingly doesn't even get him close to being able to cover his positions right now. It's just incredible when sports and commerce and world politics all come together. But I guess the one that is really leaping out to me is betting on the Little League World Series. I'm not going to mention the sportsbook's name because anybody who knows anything about this industry can probably guess who the hell it is offshore that's taking bets.
Anybody who bets online might have a clue.
Oh, that was terrible. It was practically a friggin' plug. BOL guys better send us a check for that one, since all of our degenerates are now screaming like, wait, that's available? It's just been nonstop. I think it was amazing. Dave Mason was actually on Twitter a little while ago explaining the rigid criteria for, like even games that turn out that like there's cheating, or, a kid's playing, but his birth certificate says he's 12, but he's actually 16, anything like that. We have action, and bets will not be refunded for that. It was just amazing to see how he had very thoroughly thought out how to approach the rules around cheating in the Little League World Series. But, he made a joke yesterday, or somebody commented on his putting the odds up, futures for Little League World Series. And one gentleman had responded like, you got to draw the line at betting on 12-year-olds. And Dave responded, sir, you're certainly entitled to that. But by the way, there are 11-year-olds too. I mean, good singer, good comeback, but holy shit. I mean, come on. We can't possibly be doing this, but I guess we are. And you know what? I don't think anybody should be surprised by this. It makes me wonder at what point we're going to rationalize taking bets on things like the National Spelling Bee, which I know also those guys do as well.
To add into that, I mean, they've got decades of work on this. They've probably got form from previous years, 11-year-olds that have turned to 12-year-olds the next season. I do remember a couple of things. It was one Little League World Series, and not to be hypocritical on that stuff, because I have dabbled in Little League World Series myself in a previous lifetime, but there was one Dominican kid that must have been in his 20s playing and pitching World Series, pitching almost perfect games. Funny you mentioned the spelling bee, because one of my finest stories has always been, I think it's a 2006 or 2008 spelling bee, Friday afternoon, sitting there watching TV. I think there was an either Euros or World Cup soccer going on, and just watching it. And then what happens? A little offshore book called Pinnacle opens up lines Friday night for the final day of Saturday. $50 limits, but happened to carve out a little over 10,000 result, betting on the guy with glasses and a guy with a long name, longer than probably 8 letters. So yeah, it's definitely been involved, so I can't be hypocritical on this stuff. But yeah, that's one I've lived off for a long time. Probably the most interesting thing I've ever bet on was the ESPN spelling bee at one stage in a previous lifetime.
Well, much like world cricket, yes, the South Asians, the Indian subcontinent has come to dominate that event. And so saying somebody with glasses and a very long family surname doesn't really narrow the field down all that much. But it's funny you say it like Pinnacle. What a shock. I used to tease Paris about when Pinnacle used to take action on the World CrossFit Games. They did that for a couple of years. And when they finally took it down, I was like, oh man, I've spent a whole year getting my data together on the kettlebell market. And it's just all going to waste here now. The stuff that people will bet on.
All right. I would not have bet on a reference to the World CrossFit Games or to Danny Almonte on this week's episode, but here we are. So we'll pivot from the road to Williamsport to the potential road to the Supreme Court. After a brief hiatus on the show, prediction markets are back in the mix, courtesy of a busy week in the space. Kalshi has lost rulings in Connecticut and Washington, marking states number 9 and 10, with Baltimore becoming the first city to sue prediction markets outright. Kalshi also suspended mention markets amid a new CFTC insider trading investigation. And not to be outdone, Polymarket has had its banking ties cut by JP Morgan due to regulatory risk, and a move that took place last October and surfaced this past week. Meanwhile, UK exchange Smarkets is entering the US, chasing both a sportsbook license and prediction market clearance at the same time. Adam, a lot to unpack here. I guess we'll start with Smarkets. What do you make of them trying to have it both ways compared to Kalshi's all-in bet on federal preemption?
Well, it's interesting because Smarkets were in Colorado at one point. I don't know if they're still there or whatnot. So they have had the sportsbook license. I'm curious how these regulators stand up after, again, sending a lot of nasty letters, telling us not to go into the prediction markets if we're in the sports betting market. No one's yet seemed to have stand up to that. And then I've even heard potentially Kentucky sort of backtreading on their wording of what's meant to come into place January 1st. I mean, we're staying in the sports betting game, looking at prediction markets afar, wondering how long it'll last, will it last, and all those kind of things. Definitely having conversations of understanding where the value is in the markets and the odds and stuff like that, but not entering anything at this stage. Not necessarily because of the regulators and what they've said or what they're, projecting or they're going to do, because obviously banking and everyone else has just kind of given them the middle finger and walked forward into the prediction market world. But yeah, Smarkets, hedging their bets by the looks of it. Again, both of them tough gigs. This stage, trying to go in with an exchange model against Kalshi, Polymarket, you still need to be able to get the eyeball, just like we're trying to get customers into the original OG sports betting market world. They got to sort of compete with the massive liquidities on these things. I hear some of the numbers coming out of Novig and Profit and potentially Matchbook coming together, putting their things. But the amount of liquidity and volume on Kalshi, Polymarket International and that, I see it as struggled in both of the sides right now. So hedging your bet, maybe just, making it more difficult to actually just focus on something, which ultimately we're trying to do with the sports betting, state-regulated entities, and then building that while we can and seeing what happens in 18 months, 2 years, 36 months, whatever this drags out to see sports contracts taken away from the prediction markets as well. And then we're in a strong position. If not, this is going to be a tough roll.
And Joe, to that end, as you've noted yourself on Twitter, banks and payment processors don't want to touch the legal gray area in which prediction markets operate, as JP Morgan quietly proved by cutting Polymarket loose. So with all eyes on a potential Supreme Court case, what are the odds banking is the real existential risk? And what does betting industry history tell us about how this might play out?
I would probably draw a line to DFS as something that's illustrative of this. And that was after the New York Attorney General issued cease and desist letters to FanDuel and DraftKings to stop taking real money daily fantasy sports out of the state of New York. It was interesting. Two things happened. One, FanDuel and DraftKings then had their biggest weeks ever because of all the notoriety, all the awareness that it created for them. But then the negative effect was not necessarily on FanDuel and DraftKings, but on almost every other smaller daily fantasy sports operator, which at the time also included yours truly, where we lost our credit card processing and PayPal just suddenly dried up overnight. All these things that the industry was so heavily reliant on. And what was interesting was that the payments industry, the banking industry penalized all the startups, all the small fry and everything, and somehow left FanDuel and DraftKings in place, I guess, because they were just doing so much business. But this is, I think, a bit stronger than what you saw back there in 2015, in that, at least in 2015, when you had this conflict between like a state regulator and federal law, that FanDuel and DraftKings could point to and assist their banks and their processors in looking at the 2006 federal law, the Unlawful Gambling Enforcement Act, which had the benefit of defining the difference between illegal sports betting and fantasy sports. And that, there was like a 5-prong test to show that you were a fantasy sport, and they met all of those. And that's really what allowed DFS and then DFS Plus to flourish eventually. But make no mistake about it, one of the hidden things here in the industry is the power that particularly the card associations, so Visa and MasterCard, have in determining what gets processed through their card network. Okay, that's not just credit cards, that's also ATM cards, debit cards. If they have either the Visa or the MasterCard logo on them, those guys really have a final say on what can be processed. Banks aren't necessarily going to welcome stuff that is problematic. Okay, the banks do much bigger business. I mean, as big as sports gaming, we'll call it that collectively, sports betting, and then prediction markets, as big as it seems to us, it's still a cottage industry compared to most industries in the United States. Okay. And banks, they're not going to risk any kind of sanction from the federal government. And there's no way that the CFTC can indemnify anybody against this. That's the question I have. You have the CFTC telling Kalshi to ignore the New York State court order and to continue to operate there. Well, is CFTC going to indemnify Kalshi if they violate that order and down the road get an adverse legal decision? Because remember, New York's asking for $36 billion and some pretty serious sanctions. And CFTC is not going to pony up $36 billion to save Kalshi's ass in any of this. And so this is kind of the thing that I've been waiting to see if it was going to pop its head up. And I guess the Polymarket thing is really the first of it. We'll see if there's going to be any more, but make no mistake about it. It doesn't just take the states, state courts, state gaming regulators, state lawmakers to, create some roadblocks for the prediction markets, banking and payments. I mean, who's going to do this? If it's free to play, who gives a shit, right? So if you lose your banking, you lose your payments, I guess we can all go crypto, but then that comes with its own series of problems. And I don't think the industry is ready to go full crypto just yet.
All right. Well, from a whirlwind in the prediction market space to a possible calm before the storm on the sporting calendar, but not a dark period altogether. We'll soon see European domestic soccer leagues kick off within days of each other. So, Adam, with a potential World Cup bump in mind, what futures action are you seeing in the Premier League, among others? And how does your trading team gear up for the start of these new domestic seasons?
Yeah, I mean, will there be a bump? I imagine there'll be a bit more interest in it than what there was previously. Do we expect it to compete with NFL college football as it rolls out, even MLB playoffs? Not so much. But I think the awareness of soccer, football, whatever they want to call it, definitely has happened across the board. Even the amount of people at BetBash that said, I'd never really watched this game before, but it's actually quite interesting. And then happened to run into a few people down here saying, well, I spent 2 years in England and I watch more soccer than Aussie rules now because I find that more enjoyable. So there is definitely a transition of people's interest. Early money, master-wise, Arsenal, Manchester City getting some action. Liverpool's the just wreck money, biggest loser for us right now. Chelsea to make the top four, seeing some interesting action. And also Newcastle United to be relegated, seeing some heavy master action as well at double digit. The thing that caught my surprise was Erling Haaland at odds on to win the top goal scorer before a ball's even kicked. Obviously was a behemoth in the World Cup. Looking at the names underneath him, don't recognize many of them. So definitely striker world in Premier League seems to all lead to Haaland and odds on for top goal scorer before the season even starts, when, injuries and all these other things can occur. Is very interesting market to see there.
And Joe, from domestic football in Europe to American football across the U.S. and anything else on the horizon, what are you following most closely this week?
Well, actually, I want to continue on with what Adam's talking about here and actually pick this up. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with especially the 5 top domestic leagues, and then also Champions League, and then Europa League in soccer. And the reason why I say that is like, not because necessarily of anything that the World Cup provided. And it's like the World Cup happened and then like, yeah, it was a great event. And then now you have a month off and it gives plenty of time for people to cool their jets and think about other things. But more so, and again, everybody knows I love mentioning cricket. When you look at the liquidity that particularly the Indian Premier League was able to do on like a per game basis on prediction markets, they were doing $200 million in volume for a game on the other side of the planet that nobody in America supposedly watches. Okay. But if you think like Indian Premier League cricket can generate like $200 million in liquidity on a single game, and granted they have fewer games, but just that level of interest, you do have to kind of wonder what can English Premier League or La Liga, what can they generate, and Champions League especially, what can they generate on the prediction markets? If you've got guys like, to Adam's point, like you see guys wandering around Bet Bash, like, we get a lot of young guys who are looking at this from a much more quantitative financial way and less from our traditional way of looking at it in sports betting. And it's the highest, most liquid. This is my Shake Shack being delivered here, Midran. Hey, if anybody's looking for a sponsor, it's us, Shake Shack. There you go. But if you're looking for a market that's more liquid than soccer, you're not going to find it. It has more liquidity than any other market globally here right now. And it's not like the dinner bell hasn't been rung for everybody around the planet right now about Kalshi and Polymarket, et cetera. So I'm really interested to see, once that season kicks off, just how well it performs. Will the NFL do 4 times the liquidity? Yeah, probably. But then that's the rest of the world looking at the NFL and looking at the numbers it's going to generate on Kalshi and Polymarket and company and saying like, wow, that's the most visible display of liquidity for those sports to get into. So I do wonder how much of this current moment is going to start breaking down kind of like the walls, just because of the visibility of the numbers, right? And see just how much of that is going to attract the rest of the world to our games, and then Americans to the world game, just because why not? Like, why wouldn't you be playing in those incredibly liquid markets?
Well, Joe, not to disregard all of the commentary you just gave on worldwide sports markets, but with the special delivery you just received, it begs a follow-up. What's your go-to Shake Shack order? And give us your power rankings when it comes to Shake Shack, Five Guys, In-N-Out, and any of the other U.S. fast food burger chains.
First of all, I don't know what my go-to order is at Shake Shack, because the only time I've ever had it's been in Manhattan, and that was at the other end of waiting for 45 minutes at the end of the line to get up there to get like a chocolate shake that was now chocolate milk, and a double burger that was, let's just say, it wasn't backyard grill quality. I will say, as far as ranking the 3, I'm gonna go Five Guys because I like a good sloppy burger. In-N-Out is like 1A. They're running really close behind Five Guys. I'm probably in the tank for Five Guys because it's an East Coast thing versus a West Coast thing.
I would have thought, given the Shake Shack that was just handed to you, we might have received a different answer, but the West Coaster in me is not upset with those high remarks for In-N-Out's business. We will go ahead and wrap up on that note. To the audience, however you rank your favorite fast food burgers, thanks as always for tuning in. Enjoy football that counts in Europe, football that doesn't yet count in America, plus anything else on your radar this week, and we'll catch you next week. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Prime Suspects. Register for Prime Sports at primesports.com and download the Prime Sports app. You can follow us on Twitter at @PrimeSuspects_, at Joe Brennan Jr., and at Adam Bjorn. You must be 21 or over to play on Prime Sports. Always bet responsibly and within your limits. If you or someone you know has a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER.